The cold of the marble floor seeped through the thin soles of her worn-out shoes, a chilling reminder of where she stood. Sophia moved like a ghost through the cavernous, silent mansion, a bucket of grey water in one hand, a rag in the other. Every polished surface reflected a distorted version of her, a tired, hollowed-out girl hiding a life-or-death secret beneath a baggy, threadbare sweatshirt. She was 7 months pregnant, a truth she guarded with the ferocity of a mother protecting her young. The weight in her belly was more than just a child, it was a ticking clock. If they found out, she would be back on the street, and the street was no place to bring a new life into the world. So she scrubbed, polished, and erased her own existence, praying no one would see the gentle curve that held her entire future. Her world had shrunk to this single, desperate task, to remain invisible. The hunger was a constant, dull ache in her stomach, a beast she tried to silence with sips of water from the tap in the staff bathroom. She ignored the sharp pain in her lower back and the exhaustion that settled deep in her bones, threatening to pull her down to the floor. She was an undocumented shadow, a name on no list, a person with no rights. The mansion wasn't a workplace. It was a tightrope she walked every day, suspended over an abyss of homelessness and despair. One wrong move, one sign of weakness, one moment of vulnerability, and she would fall. She could not afford to fall. For her, survival was a performance, and the stage was unforgiving. For days, a strange disquiet had settled inside her. It wasn't pain, not in the way she understood it. It was a flutter, a wrongness, a persistent, unnerving hum beneath her ribs. The baby, her silent companion in this lonely struggle, seemed to be moving differently, not with the joyful kicks of a healthy child, but with a frantic, desperate energy, as if it were trying to tell her something, as if it were fighting for air. She would pause, her hand instinctively going to her belly, trying to decipher the message her body was sending. It felt like a premonition, a cold whisper of dread that had nothing to do with her hunger or her fear of being discovered. It was a deeper, more primal terror, one that spoke of a danger she could feel but could not name. The wave of dizziness hit her without warning. She was polishing a large glass table, her own gaunt reflection staring back at her, when the room began to tilt. Her hand shot out to steady herself, leaving a sweaty palm print on the floorless surface. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Had anyone seen? She frantically wiped the print away, her breath catching in her throat. The mansion remained silent, its vast, empty rooms indifferent to her struggle. In that moment, she was utterly alone, fighting a battle within her own body in a place where her humanity was worth less than a clean surface. She wasn't a person here. She was a function, a pair of hands, and hands that trembled were hands that could be replaced. Later, hidden in the darkness of a small supply closet, she finally allowed herself a moment of weakness. Leaning against a stack of cleaning supplies, she closed her eyes and slid her hand under her sweatshirt, pressing her palm against her swollen belly. The strange, urgent movements continued beneath her touch. Tears she refused to shed in the open burned behind her eyes. She wasn't just tired or hungry or scared. She was a mother, and her instinct was screaming that her child was in danger. But who would listen to a ghost, in a world that had already thrown her away? Her intuition was a silent scream in a soundproof room. She didn't want charity. She didn't want pity. She just wanted someone to believe her. The strange feeling was no longer a flutter. It had become a frantic, desperate pulse inside her, a silent alarm bell only she could hear. Sophia stopped polishing the silver, her hand flying to her belly as a wave of cold dread washed over her. She stood frozen in the grand hallway, her face a mask of pure terror. It wasn't pain. It was a certainty, a primal knowledge that something was terribly wrong. The head housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Gable, whose world was built on order and efficiency, saw her from across the hall. She didn't see a terrified mother-to-be. She saw an idle employee, a disruption in her perfect schedule. Her lips tightened into a thin, unforgiving line. To her, Sophia's fear was just a shadow, an inconvenient stain on the pristine silence of the mansion. Gathering what little strength she had, Sophia approached Mrs. Gable, her voice a fragile whisper. She tried to articulate the chaos unfolding within her. Not a cramp, not a kick, but a muffled, urgent struggle that felt like a fight for air. "Something is wrong," she repeated, her eyes wide with a plea for belief. "I can feel it." Mrs. Gable dismissed her with a sharp, impatient wave of her hand. "Nonsense," she snapped, her tone dripping with condescension. "You're tired. You're not eating properly. Stop being dramatic and get back to the dining room chandelier. It won't polish itself." The housekeeper's words were small, hard stones, each one chipping away at Sophia's hope. She was being told that her deepest, most terrifying instinct was nothing more than an annoyance. Desperation gave her a voice she didn't know she possessed. "No," Sophia insisted, her voice trembling, but gaining an ounce of strength. "It's not normal. Please, I think I need to see a doctor." The request hung in the opulent air, an impossible demand from a ghost who wasn't supposed to have needs. Mrs. Gable's face contorted, shifting from disbelief to pure anger. "A doctor?" she scoffed. "Do you have any idea how ridiculous you sound? You are here to work, not to invent ailments for a day off. We don't provide medical services for temporary help." The unspoken insults, illegal, unreliable, unworthy, filled the silence between them. Another cleaner, watching from a doorway, quickly averted her gaze, her silence a quiet vote of condemnation. With every door of communication slammed shut, Sophia made a decision born of pure maternal panic. She turned away from Mrs. Gable, not toward the dining room, but toward the massive oak doors at the end of the hall, the entrance to Mr. Vance's private study, the one room she was strictly forbidden to enter. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of rebellion. This was insubordination. This was career suicide. But the silent scream in her womb had grown too loud to ignore. She would find a phone. She would call for help herself, even if it meant being cast back out into the unforgiving streets. It was a reckless, desperate act that, to anyone watching, looked like a flagrant, calculated violation of the rules. Mrs. Gable's face flushed with a deep, furious red. "Where do you think you're going? Stop this instant!" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper, terrified of disturbing the master of the house. She hurried after Sophia, her sensible shoes clicking angrily on the marble floor. In the housekeeper's rigid mind, this was the ultimate betrayal. The girl wasn't just lazy, she was deceitful, insolent, and now, a trespasser. A clear narrative formed in her mind. This ungrateful foreigner, given a rare chance, was now trying to manipulate her way into something more aight, perhaps even looking for an opportunity to steal. Sophia was no longer a person. She was a problem to be swiftly and permanently removed. Sophia ignored the hissed commands, her entire being focused on the goal ahead. She reached the imposing study doors and, without a moment's hesitation, pushed one open. The room was dark and cool, smelling of old books, leather, and a faint, masculine scent of cologne. Her eyes locked on the prize, a sleek black telephone resting on the corner of a vast, empty desk. It was a lifeline. As her foot crossed the threshold, Mrs. Gable grabbed her arm, her fingers digging into Sophia's skin like talons. "You will leave this house now," she seethed, her voice low and trembling with rage. "I will not have a liar and a thief under this roof." The judgment was swift and absolute. Her terror was a lie. Her instinct was a trick. With a surge of adrenaline she didn't know she possessed, Sophia wrenched her arm free. "I am not lying," she cried out, her voice finally breaking, thick with a pain that had nothing to do with the housekeeper's grip. "My baby. Something is wrong with my baby." The words were raw, torn from a place of pure primal fear. But to Mrs. Gable, it was merely a more theatrical line in a pathetic play for sympathy. The accusation of being a liar stung more than any physical threat. Her dignity, the last tattered remnant of who she used to be, was being shredded before her eyes. She was being painted as the villain in her own tragedy, her maternal terror dismissed as a cheap and manipulative performance. The confrontation shattered the mansion's sacred quiet. Sophia stood cornered in the doorway of the forbidden room, her hand protectively shielding her belly, her eyes blazing with the fierce light of a mother fighting for her child. But Mrs. Gable saw only defiance. Other staff members, drawn by the commotion, peered from shadowed hallways, their faces a mixture of fear and disapproval. They saw an outsider, one of their own, breaking the cardinal rule and threatening the fragile stability of their existence. To them, Sophia was not just risking her own job, she was a liability, a disruption that could bring unwanted wrath down on them all. In that moment, she was utterly alone, condemned by a jury that refused to hear her truth. If this story touched you, like and share. So many people live this reality in silence. The sound was an unwelcome intrusion, a discordant note in the symphony of silence he had so carefully curated. Adrian Vance did not look up from the architectural blueprints spread across his massive mahogany desk. He didn't have to. He felt the disturbance in the air, a ripple of chaos from the world beyond his study. This room was his sanctuary, a sterile fortress of glass and steel where emotions were weaknesses and logic was the only god. His world was one of calculated risks and predictable outcomes, of numbers on a screen and contracts signed in black ink. The raw, messy sound of a human conflict was an irritant, a piece of grit in the flawless machinery of his life. He wore a perfectly tailored suit that felt more like armor, and his face was a mask of detached control. When the door to his study creaked open, his eyes, the color of cold steel, finally lifted. He saw the scene framed in the doorway, the flushed, furious face of his housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, her hand clamped on the arm of a trembling, disheveled cleaner. He didn't see Sophia. He saw a problem, an inefficiency, a poorly managed situation that had now breached the perimeter of his solitude. His gaze swept over her, the cheap, oversized sweatshirt, the wild fear in her eyes, the defiant posture of her body shielding her stomach. He processed it all, not with empathy, but with a cold, analytical precision. This was a disruption, and disruptions were to be eliminated quickly and quietly. His first thought was not of her, but of his housekeeper's failure to contain the issue. Sophia's voice, and when it came, was a raw, desperate whisper that seemed to be physically torn from her throat. "Please, sir, I need help. Something is wrong with my baby." The words hung in the opulent air, fragile and out of place amidst the scent of old leather and expensive cologne. Adrian's expression didn't soften. It tightened. The mention of a baby was like a key turning in a lock he had spent a decade trying to rust shut. It was a trigger, a reminder of a vulnerability he had vowed never to feel again. He saw not a mother's plea, but a calculated, emotional play. It was weakness weaponized, and he had built his entire empire on the principle of never succumbing to it. He looked through her, his gaze utterly devoid of compassion. Mrs. Gable, sensing his displeasure, quickly filled the silence with her own harsh verdict. "She is lying, Mr. Vance. She has been looking for excuses all morning, refusing to do her work. Now she invades your privacy with this performance." The housekeeper's words landed like stones, building a wall of condemnation around Sophia. To Adrian, this explanation was logical. It fit the cynical framework through which he viewed the world. People were driven by self-interest. They manipulated. They exaggerated. They lied to get what they wanted. This girl was no different. He accepted the housekeeper's assessment without a flicker of doubt, because it was easier than confronting the raw, terrified humanity standing in his doorway. It was a truth that kept his own ghosts at bay. He finally spoke, his voice low and dangerously calm, the words precise and sharp as scalpels. He addressed Sophia, but his tone made it clear he was speaking to an object, not a person. "This is a place of employment. It is not a shelter, and it is not a hospital. Your personal problems are not my concern." He paused, letting the cruelty of his indifference settle in the air between them. "If you cannot perform the duties for which you are paid, you are free to leave. There are countless others who would be grateful for the opportunity you seem so determined to waste." The threat was absolute, a clean, surgical cut. He was not just firing her, he was invalidating her fear, her instinct, her very existence. In that moment, two worlds collided with the force of an earthquake that only one of them could feel. For him, it was a minor annoyance, a footnote in a busy day. For her, it was the end of the line. She stood in a room that likely cost more than she could ever earn in 100 lifetimes, facing a man who held the power of life and death in a single, dismissive sentence. He saw an insubordinate employee. She felt a life fluttering desperately inside her. He heard a complaint. She heard a silent scream. The chasm between them was not just about wealth. It was about humanity. It was the abyss between a man who had armored his heart in grief and a woman who had nothing left but hers. But something in her refused to break completely. She met his cold, empty gaze, and for a fleeting second the fear in her eyes was replaced by a profound, heart-breaking certainty. A single tear traced a path down her dusty cheek. "It doesn't matter if you believe me," she whispered, her voice barely audible but ringing with the clarity of truth. "It's happening." The words were not an accusation or a plea. They were a statement of fact, a final, desperate testimony from a soul that had been pushed beyond the edge of despair. For an infinitesimal moment, a crack appeared in Adrian's icy facade, a flicker of something unreadable, a ghost of a memory he instantly suppressed. He hardened his expression, erasing the momentary weakness. He turned away from her, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. The conversation was over. The problem was solved. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his back to them as he looked down at his blueprints. "Remove her from the property. Immediately. I don't want to see her again." He picked up a pen. His focus already shifted back to the clean lines and predictable angles of his work. The world was back in order. The door clicked shut behind her, a sound of finality that echoed in the vast, silent room. He had successfully excised the chaos, but as he stared at the plans on his desk, he could not shake the faint, unsettling image of a single tear on a desperate woman's face. The clash was over, but a shard of her world had been left behind in his. Mrs. Gable's grip was a vice on Sophia's arm, her intention clear, to physically drag her from the premises like a piece of refuse. But Sophia stood her ground, her worn-out shoes seemingly rooted to the polished marble. It wasn't a resistance of strength, but of sheer, unyielding terror. She couldn't leave. Leaving meant surrendering her child to a fate she couldn't bear to imagine. "No," she breathed, the word a fragile shield against the housekeeper's fury. The other staff members watched from the shadows, their faces a mixture of fear and judgment. They didn't see a mother fighting for her baby. They saw a disruption, a foreigner causing trouble, and they silently willed her to disappear before she brought the master's wrath down upon them all. The world tilted again, this time with a violent, undeniable finality. A wave of dizziness, sharper and more profound than before, buckled Sophia's knees. The strange, frantic fluttering inside her became a sharp, searing clench, stealing her breath. She gasped, her hand flying to her belly as her body finally surrendered. She crumpled, not with a dramatic cry, but with a silent, heavy fall, her shoulder hitting the ornate wall with a dull thud. Mrs. Gable recoiled, her anger momentarily replaced by shock and disgust, as if Sophia's collapse were a deliberate and offensive act. Sophia slid down the wall, her body a question mark of pain, her eyes wide with a terror that had now become physical, undeniable, and terrifyingly real. The sound of her fall, though soft, was a cannon blast in the mansion's oppressive silence. It drew Adrian from his study like a magnet. He reappeared in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury. He saw her slumped on his floor, a stain of human frailty on his perfect, orderly world. His first thought was not of concern, but of profound irritation. This was an escalation, a pathetic, theatrical bid for attention that he refused to indulge. He looked at Mrs. Gable, his eyes like chips of ice, demanding an explanation for why this problem hadn't been disposed of yet. The tension in the hallway became a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket of judgment woven from wealth, power, and a complete lack of compassion. Mrs. Gable, recovering her composure, rushed to validate his worldview. "A performance, sir, just as I said," she whispered, her voice laced with a triumphant venom. "She is trying to manipulate you, to force your hand. She knows that if she creates a scene, you might—" The housekeeper trailed off, letting the insinuation hang in the air. "You might give her money to go away." The other servants nodded in silent agreement, their expressions hardening. In their world of strict rules and hierarchies, Sophia's collapse was a violation, a desperate and cheap trick. They saw her as a threat to their own fragile security, a wild card who didn't know her place, and their collective condemnation provided Adrian with all the justification he needed to remain detached. But from the floor, Sophia looked up, her gaze cutting through the haze of her pain. She locked eyes with Adrian, and in that moment, she was not begging. Her voice was a ragged whisper, but it carried the weight of an unbreakable vow. "I don't want your money," she said, each word an effort. "I want you to listen." It was not a plea for help, but a demand for acknowledgement. She resisted their narrative, refused to be labeled a liar or a manipulator. In her profound vulnerability, she found a strange and powerful dignity. She was a mother speaking a truth her body was screaming, and she would not allow them to silence it, even if it was the last thing she ever did. The raw sincerity in her eyes was a direct assault on his cynicism. For a split second, the image of another woman, pale and frightened in a sterile hospital room, flashed behind Adrian's eyes. His wife. The memory was an ambush, a ghost he had buried under a mountain of work and indifference. He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. He hated this feeling, this crack in his armor, this unwelcome echo of a pain he thought he had mastered. His instinct was to turn, to walk back into his study and close the door, to shut out the ghost she had so carelessly resurrected. His resistance was no longer just against her. It was against himself, against the crushing weight of a past he could not escape. The tension was now internal, a silent war raging behind his cold, impassive mask. A heavy silence descended upon the hallway. Adrian stood frozen, a statue of conflicted power. He, who could move markets with a single phone call, was rendered immobile by a collapsed, undocumented cleaner. She had inadvertently stripped him of his usual weapons, logic, money, and intimidation. He couldn't reason with her pain, he couldn't fire her from the floor, and his threatening presence seemed to have no effect. The power dynamic had been shattered. In her utter powerlessness, Sophia had become the most powerful person in the room, her silent suffering a judgment on his entire existence. He was trapped between the cold logic that demanded he discard her and the terrifying, long-dead empathy that her desperate eyes had reawakened. His mind, always seeking the most efficient solution, began to race. He ignored the whispers of his past and focused on the practicalities of the present. Liability. That was the word that surfaced. A sick employee on his property. An accident waiting to happen. A potential lawsuit. A story for the tabloids. His decision. When it came, one was not born of compassion, but of cold, calculated risk management. He needed to contain the situation, to move the problem out of sight where it could be managed without emotion. He would not help her. He would simply control the damage. This was not an act of kindness. It was a strategic move on a chessboard he hadn't asked to play. He finally broke the silence, his voice clipped and devoid of any warmth. He did not look at Sophia. He addressed his housekeeper. Take her to the old chauffeur's room in the West Wing, give her a bottle of water, and find out who she is. The order was a compromise, a temporary solution that kept her on the property but far from his sight. It was not an offer of help. It was an act of quarantine. He was isolating the source of his discomfort. To Mrs. Gable, it was a confusing, almost weak command, but she obeyed instantly, relieved to have a directive. For Adrian, it was a way to postpone a decision he didn't want to make, a way to push the uncomfortable reality of her humanity a few doors further away. As two other staff members reluctantly helped a weak and trembling Sophia to her feet, her eyes met Adrian's one last time. There was no gratitude in her expression, only a deep, weary mistrust. She understood his gesture for what it was, not sanctuary, but a holding cell. She accepted because she had no other choice, because any room with a roof was better than the street, but she knew she was still alone. She was a problem being managed, a liability being contained. He turned and walked back into his study without another word, the heavy oak door closing with a definitive click. The tension had not been resolved. It had simply been relocated, and in the sterile silence of his fortress, Adrian Vance was now locked in with a ghost he could no longer ignore. He sat in the sterile silence of his study, the rhythmic tick of a grandfather clock the only sound. He had made the call not out of compassion, but out of a cold, calculated need to mitigate risk. Dr. Alistair Finch was on his way to silence the disruptive cleaner, to medically invalidate her pathetic performance, so he could remove her from his property without legal consequence. Adrian Vance paced the Persian rug, his irritation a palpable force in the room. Every minute spent on this charade was a minute stolen from his empire. He saw her collapse not as a medical emergency, but as a final, desperate gambit in a game of manipulation. He had built his life on seeing through such weaknesses, and he would not be played by a destitute, dramatic girl. Dr. Finch arrived with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to wealth and its eccentric demands. He was calm, professional, his leather bag holding the tools of logic and science. Adrian met him in the foyer, his instructions clipped and devoid of warmth. "She's in the old chauffeur's room, West Wing. Claims something is wrong. I need a professional assessment before I have her removed." He didn't say her name. He referred to her as she, a problem to be diagnosed and disposed of. He didn't walk the doctor to the room. He simply pointed, a gesture of supreme detachment. This was a transaction. He was paying for a problem to disappear, and he expected the same dispassionate service he received from his lawyers and accountants. While he waited, an unnerving silence fell over the mansion. The usual hum of distant cleaning and maintenance had ceased, as if the entire estate were holding its breath. Adrian found himself unable to focus on the blueprints spread across his desk. Drawn by an impulse he didn't understand, he walked toward the West Wing. As he neared the chauffeur's room, he heard it, a sound so faint it was almost imaginary. It was Sophia's voice, a soft, desperate whisper. She wasn't crying or screaming, she was talking, her words a gentle, pleading murmur directed at her own belly. It was the universal, private language of a mother soothing her unborn child, a sound of pure, unconditional love that breached his defenses like a ghost through a wall. "Doctor." Finch returned far sooner than Adrian anticipated, his face stripped of its professional calm. A deep, troubled gravity had settled in his features. He walked straight into the study, foregoing any medical pleasantries, and looked Adrian directly in the eye. "We have a critical situation," the doctor said, his voice low and urgent. She wasn't exaggerating. "She's in a state of severe fetal distress." The clinical words hung in the air, dismantling Adrian's carefully constructed narrative of lies and manipulation piece by piece. This was not a performance. This was not drama. The problem he had tried to quarantine was real, and it was unfolding under his roof, a direct consequence of his own callous disbelief. A cold knot of unease began to tighten in his stomach. The doctor continued, his tone grim as he laid out the medical facts. "It's a nuchal cord, a severe one. The baby's oxygen supply is being compromised. Her strange feeling, as she called it, wasn't in her head. It was her maternal instinct screaming at her that her child was fighting for its life." Each word was a precise, surgical cut into Adrian's cynicism. He had dismissed her intuition as ignorance, her fear as a ploy for pity. Now, science was validating her every desperate plea. He saw her face in his mind, the raw terror in her eyes, the fierce protectiveness of her hand on her belly. He had looked at a mother's primal fear and seen only weakness, a profound and terrible misjudgment that now echoed in the silent room. Then, Dr. Finch, completely unaware of the decade-old wound he was about to tear open, delivered the final devastating sentence. He shook his head in disbelief, a look of profound respect for Sophia in his eyes. Her instinct was the only thing that kept them alive, Adrian. She knew. She fought for someone to listen. He paused, his gaze locking with Adrian's. "If we had waited a couple more hours, we would have lost them both." The words struck Adrian with the force of a physical blow. They were the exact, haunting refrain that had tormented his nightmares for 10 years. The words the emergency room doctor had spoken about his wife, Eleanor, after the accident. The world around him fractured, the past and present colliding in a blinding flash of unbearable pain. His study dissolved. He was no longer a powerful magnate in a mansion, but a broken man standing in a cold, white hospital corridor, the smell of antiseptic choking him. He saw Elena's face, pale and trusting, her hand on her own swollen belly just hours before she was gone forever. And then he saw Sophia, a stranger, yet her fear was the same, her fight was the same. His cruelty, his cold dismissal, his cynical judgment. He had aimed it all at a woman who was living his wife's final, desperate moments. The crushing weight of the guilt he had buried for a decade erupted, a volcanic surge of self-loathing and horror. He had almost let it happen again. He had almost become the architect of the very tragedy that had destroyed his soul. Through a haze of grief, his perception of Sophia irrevocably shifted. She was no longer an inconvenience, a liar or a problem. She was a reflection of Eleanor. She was a mother, fierce and terrified, whose only weapon was an intuition he had mocked. He had stood as judge and jury, condemning her for the very virtue that was her child's only hope. The injustice of his actions was a physical sickness rising in his throat. He had wielded his power and wealth not to protect, but to crush the most vulnerable person who had ever crossed his path. He hadn't just been wrong, he had been a monster, blinded by his own pain and privilege, and he had almost paid for it with 2 more lives. The paralysis of horror finally broke, replaced by a frantic, desperate urgency. This time, he was not helpless. This time, he could intervene. He turned to Dr. Finch, his voice a raw, broken thing he barely recognized as his own. "Do whatever it takes," he commanded, the words torn from his soul. "My helicopter is on the roof. Get her to the best neonatal unit in the state. I don't care what it costs. Just save them. Please, save them both." It was not an order from a billionaire. It was the desperate plea of a man begging the universe for a chance at redemption, a chance to rewrite the ending of the story that had ruined his life. He was no longer managing a situation. He was fighting for atonement. As Dr. Finch rushed to mobilize the emergency transport, Adrian walked numbly from his study. He stopped just outside the chauffeur's room, his hand trembling as it reached for the doorknob. He couldn't face her. He couldn't look into the eyes of the woman he had so terribly wronged. Instead, in a gesture of profound, unspoken apology, he slipped off his own expensive cashmere coat, the dark, tailored armor he wore against the world. He folded it carefully and laid it on the floor just outside her door, a silent offering of warmth, of protection, of a promise. It was the first crack in his fortress, the first piece of himself he had offered to another human being in 10 years. The millionaire was gone, and in his place stood a broken man, praying for a miracle. Do you believe in second chances? Comment below. We want to hear from you. The hours that followed were a blur of controlled chaos, orchestrated by a man unmoored from his own life. Adrian Vance, who had built an empire on calculated distance, was now intimately involved in every detail. He stood on the helipad, the wind whipping at his suit, as Sophia was carefully loaded onto his private helicopter. He didn't watch from a window. He watched from the edge, his face pale and grim, as if his presence alone could will them to safety. At the hospital, he was a silent, imposing spectre in the hallways, his wealth a battering ram that cleared every obstacle. He secured the top neonatal surgeon, a private recovery suite, and a level of care reserved for royalty, all with the cold efficiency of a business deal. But this was not business. It was a desperate, frantic act of penance. He did not return to the sterile comfort of his mansion. Instead, Adrian sat in the harsh, fluorescent lighting of the hospital waiting room, a ghost among strangers. He refused the private lounge offered to him, choosing to share the worn vinyl chairs and the stale coffee with the other anxious souls keeping vigil. For the first time in 10 years, he was not insulating himself from pain. He was immersing himself in it. Every beep of a machine, every hushed conversation was a reminder of the corridor where his own world had ended. He saw Elena's face in the flickering lights, heard her voice in the silence, but now it was Sophia's terrified eyes he saw when he closed his own, her desperate fight merging with his wife's memory until they became one unbearable. Sacred story of motherhood. The surgeon, a woman with tired but kind eyes, finally emerged. "They're both stable," she announced, her voice gentle but firm. "You got her here just in time. A little longer, and the story would be very different." The words, a softer echo of the ones that haunted him, did not bring triumph, only a deep, shuddering wave of relief that left him breathless. Later, he stood outside the neonatal unit, looking through the glass at a tiny, perfect life in an incubator, a boy. He was so small, so fragile, a testament to a mother's instinct and a stranger's last-minute redemption. In that moment, watching the steady rise and fall of the baby's chest, Adrian Vance felt the tectonic plates of his grief shift. This was not a replacement for what he'd lost, but a chance to honor it. Days later, he entered Sophia's hospital room. The air between them was thick with unspoken truths. He stood awkwardly by the door, his power and wealth utterly useless. He didn't offer empty apologies. Instead, he offered a future. "There is a small guest house on the west side of the property," he began, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual command. "It's private. It's safe. It's yours, for as long as you and your son need it." He explained there would be a salary, a quiet job for her maintaining the estate's gardens when she was ready. It was not an offer of employment, it was an offer of sanctuary. Sophia watched him, her gaze searching his face, looking for the cold, cruel man she had met. He was gone, replaced by someone haunted and profoundly human. She accepted with a single, slow nod, her dignity a quiet shield around her. The day she left the hospital, Adrian drove her himself, not in his chauffeured limousine, but in a simple sedan. He carried her bags to the door of the sunlit cottage and handed her a single crude brass key. It felt heavy in her palm, more than just metal. It was the weight of a new life. As she stood in the doorway, her son cradled in her arms, she looked back at Adrian, who waited by the car. There were no words of thanks, none were needed. He had given her a home, a place to be seen. In doing so, he had unlocked a door in his own heart. Letting in the first ray of light in a decade, justice had arrived not as a verdict, but as a quiet, shared beginning. 6 months passed, not as a measure of time, but as the turning of a season in the soul. The guest house was no longer a place of shelter. It was a home, filled with the scent of blooming roses from the garden and the soft sounds of a baby's breath. Sophia was transformed. The fear that had hollowed out her features was replaced by a quiet strength, her hands now tending to new life in the soil instead of scrubbing away her own existence. She would sit on the small porch, her son Leo sleeping peacefully in her arms, and watch the sun set over the vast estate. She was no longer a ghost haunting the halls of the powerful E, but a woman rooted in her own small patch of earth, her dignity restored not by charity, but by the simple, profound act of being seen. From the window of his stark, minimalist study, Adrian Vance watched them. He no longer saw a problem or a liability. He saw a miracle he had almost destroyed. The mansion, once a cold tomb for his memories, now felt different. The sound of a baby's distant cry, carried on the breeze, did not trigger pain but a strange, protective warmth. He found himself walking the grounds more often, not to inspect the work, but to catch a glimpse of Sophia in the garden, a small, resilient figure coaxing life from the dirt. He was still a solitary man, but his solitude was no longer a fortress. It was becoming a watchtower. He was a guardian of the peace he had so callously threatened, finding a quiet purpose in their safety. Their interactions were rare and filled with a respectful silence that spoke more than words ever could. One afternoon he approached her as she pruned a rosebush, Leo asleep in a carrier strapped to her chest. He didn't offer money or grand pronouncements. He simply handed her a small hand-carved wooden bird, its surface worn smooth with time. "It was my wife's," he said, his voice low and thick with a history of unspoken grief. She believed every child should have something made of wood and love. Sophia took it, her fingers brushing his, and in that brief touch, an entire universe of pain, forgiveness, and shared humanity was exchanged. She didn't say, "Thank you." She simply nodded, her eyes saying everything he needed to hear. A week later, Adrian found the small wooden bird sitting on the mantelpiece in his study. Beside it lay a single, perfect white rose from the garden. It was a silent answer, an offering of peace. He understood instantly. She was not just accepting his past, she was helping him carry it. She was acknowledging Elena, not as a ghost between them, but as the reason they had found each other. In that simple, profound gesture, Sophia had ceased to be a person he was saving. She had become his equal, a fellow survivor who understood that the deepest wounds are not healed by being erased, but by being honored. He picked up the rose, its fragrance filling the sterile room with a scent of life he had long forgotten. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of violet and gold, a profound peace settled over the estate. Sophia sat on her porch, humming a soft lullaby to Leo, her face illuminated by the warm light spilling from her window. She was safe. She was whole. In his study, Adrian stood not before blueprints of steel, but before a window looking out at her small cottage of light. The crushing guilt he had carried for a decade had not vanished, but it had been transformed. It was no longer a stone drowning him, but an anchor grounding him in a new reality. He had failed to save one family, but the universe, in its strange and painful mercy, had given him a chance to protect another. He walked out into the cool night air, the scent of roses and damp earth a balm to his soul. He saw her silhouette on the porch, a modern Madonna bathed in gentle light. She looked up, and their eyes met across the lawn. There was no debt, no obligation, only a quiet, unbreakable bond forged in the crucible of a near tragedy. She gave him a small, knowing smile, and he returned it with a slow, grateful nod. He had offered her a key to a house, but she had given him back a piece of his own heart. For in the end, dignity is not something you are given. It is something you are allowed to reclaim. If this moved you, subscribe to the channel and send this video to someone who needs a little hope.